Good afternoon. We have breaking news. We are waiting word on a verdict in the child cruelty case against Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula.
He's facing charges in a misdemeanor child cruelty case involving his 7-year-old daughter. And while we wait for the reading of the verdict, we bring in our legal analyst, David Mugridge, to talk about the case so far. Thanks for joining us, David.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Now, a quick preamble. We're anticipating that we're going to go live to the court momentarily. They're going to read the verdict at about 3:30, we have been told. Lay out for us, if you can, David. There are a couple of scenarios that could happen here.
Well, we know at this point, because of how it's been announced, that the jury is not hung. They've got a verdict one way or the other. It's either straight guilty or straight not guilty, and that's a huge distinction now.
And one thing that a lot of people have asked through the course of this trial is, why go through all of this for Arambula? Why put his daughter through this? Does this have to do more, do you think, with his political future or with his medical license?
Well, you have to recall that there are two sides to it. Dr. Arambula made the decision that he had to fight these allegations, and that if he didn't fight them, it would be just as bad as it would be to go to trial. And so at that point, the district attorney got involved, and you could ask the question, why did they go forward with it? Because they could have dropped it themselves.
And it is a misdemeanor, not how common is it for a misdemeanor to go to court like this?
Extremely uncommon. In my experience, 35 years of practice of criminal defense here in Fresno, I've never seen a misdemeanor case that got this much attention, but there are reasons for that on both sides. Dr. Arambula could stand to lose his license to practice medicine if he's convicted. He's a pediatrician, recall, and if he's convicted of child abuse, that's not going to help his career, even if the medical board doesn't put him under probation. And then politically, if he's convicted even of misdemeanor child abuse, you can imagine the advantage that any opponents to his seat are going to take.
What's the next step? Jump forward a little bit, that we have a verdict one way or the other. Where does this play out? If he is guilty, he's looking at what, 6 months?
Well, if he is guilty, the most that he could get would be 6 months of actual time in custody.
Right.
And there's no way of knowing for sure whether or not the court would actually impose any time in custody. Oftentimes when a defendant takes a case to trial and doesn't take a plea agreement that's offered, the court is a little bit more inclined to impose some custody on them. But even if he doesn't get custody imposed, once he gets that jury verdict, that's going to have huge impact on his life.
The possibility of probation, is that still on the table too?
That is still on the table as well. And then what will happen, because it's a misdemeanor, I'm saying if it's a misdemeanor conviction, unlike a felony, he would have 30 days to file a notice of appeal rather than 60.
And the ruling from the jury has to be unanimous. Explain that to us, how that breaks down.
Well, under California law, and understand that there are some states that are different. The Constitution doesn't require that you have 12 jurors finding unanimously, but in California it does. So that means if you have 11 jurors that find him guilty and one that says not guilty, they're hung. But because of how they have announced this, we know that the jury has actually reached a verdict, either guilty or not guilty. There's no two ways around it.
If he is found guilty, do they risk having their children taken out of the home a second time, which happened right after his arrest?
No, that's not likely. It's possible, but you remember that CPS already did their examination, and they did a much more thorough evaluation than the prosecution did in their case. So it's not unheard of, but it would be very unlikely that CPS would change their mind.
Yeah, Child Protective Services, they gave the children back to the couple after the incident.
And you'll recall that they did a much more intensive investigation, talking to friends and family members, and so they have a good idea of what happened, and they were not afraid to return the children to Dr. Arambula and his wife.
I'm communicating with Pedro Quintana, who's inside the courtroom for us right now. He says it's packed. Family supporters are here. Defense and prosecutors are here. It's a packed courtroom, he says. Why do you think this case has not just gathered so much momentum here locally, but really nationally? This is a national story. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, there is one very interesting issue that's involved in here, and that is the question of what is proper limit for parental discipline of their kids. That's a fuzzy line.
Right.
We don't know when discipline becomes abuse. It's not as if the penal code says you can swat them once on their butt, but you can't swat them twice, or you can use one knuckle to rap them in the head, but you can't use two.
Yes.
We don't know. And that's what opens the door to negotiations between these two different sides. But in this case, The line was drawn in the sand early on by both sides when Dr. Arambula came out and said, I did not spank my child
Right.
on the buttocks. I just did not do that. And then the district attorney got information from their investigation, and they didn't really have a choice either, because if they had not proceeded, people could have argued that, well, you gave Dr.
Right.
Arambula a benefit that you wouldn't give to other people. So both sides kind of set it up for what has happened, which is a trial.
And go ahead,
I
Catherine.
was say, how common is it too? Because they had the children, the 7-year-old and the 6-year-old daughter, testify in court about the discipline that they received and who disciplines them in the family, mom or dad.
That's very unusual. And again, because most of these cases settle before going to what they did in this case was the extreme of taking a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old and putting them on the witness stand. That is almost unheard of.
And I just texted Pedro Quintana. We're looking at what looks like the scene from file video. There's Dr. Joaquin Arambula. The impact on the family, regardless of how the jury rules on this, has just got to be devastating on so many levels.
And we've heard that already from Mr. Aide in his closing argument.
Right, the defense attorney.
You know, what has happened to this family? I mean, can you imagine them all sitting around the dinner table and not discussing what has happened and the testimony that the girls went through and the potential impact on their family life and the fact that the parents are almost afraid now to discipline their own children?
Yeah.
The wife had testified in court that now when she is disciplining the oldest daughter, she records it without the child's knowledge because she's afraid of what accusations may follow, but they have to discipline their kids.
And that's beyond rare. That's just unheard of.
Yeah, and the wife, Elizabeth, testified, as did his mother, Amy, the father, Juan Arambula. This has been a whole family dragged into the court over this.
No question about it. And that's why I say, no matter how this comes out, the family's going to lose because they have had their life picked apart in the media. People have had a chance to look at how they raised their children and question whether or not it was correct or not correct. And it's not something they're just going to be able to walk away. We know, for example, right now that they are in counseling.
Right. Understandably so. Again, I'm communicating with Pedro Quintana, who is now in the courtroom. If you're just joining us, we are waiting for a verdict from the jury in the Joaquin Arambula child cruelty case. Pedro is telling me that Arambula is now in the courtroom. He appears to be a little bit nervous, according to Pedro, has that cross necklace wrapped around his hand, and we are waiting just momentarily to go live to the courtroom.
And we're hearing that the jury has walked into the courtroom. The judge is now in the courtroom, and we are going to be bringing in our TV viewers live, joining us, our digital viewers online, because this verdict is expected to be announced any second. The jury notified the court about 2:45 this afternoon that they had reached a verdict in this case.
So stay with us. We're going to take a slight pause, and then we're going to come back on television line as well as on the internet. Stay with us.
Now, CBS47 Eyewitness News brings you breaking news.
Good afternoon. We are interrupting our regularly scheduled program today to bring you breaking news. A verdict has been reached in the child cruelty case against Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula.
And he's facing charges in a misdemeanor child cruelty case involving his 7-year-old daughter. We now have some live coverage on the reading of the verdict. We have live images coming out of the courtroom. The judge is in the courtroom now. Jury has been seated, and you can see that the defendant and his attorneys have also returned to the courtroom along with prosecutors in this case. As we are waiting.
And it's my understanding, sir, that the jury has reached a verdict. Is that correct?
Let's listen in.
All right. Would you be so kind as to hand the binder over to the deputy? Thank you very much. All right, Madam Judicial Assistant, would you be so kind as to announce the verdict?
The Superior Court of California, County of Fresno, Central Division, the people of the state of California versus Joaquin Arambula, in case number M199138880. Verdict. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Joaquin Arambula, not guilty of a violation of 273A(b), cruelty to child by inflicting unjustifiable physical pain or mental suffering, as charged in count 1 of the complaint filed herein. Dated May 16, 2019, signed jury foreperson.
Thank you very much. Does either side wish to poll the jury?
No, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this completes your duty in this case. I wish to express my appreciation and that of the parties for your services in this case. It is a great personal sacrifice to serve as a juror, and by doing so, you are fulfilling an extremely important role in our system of justice. You've been very attentive and conscientious throughout the proceedings, and again, we're very grateful for your dedication. Throughout this trial, I continue to admonish you that you could not discuss the facts of the case with anyone other than a fellow juror, and only during their deliberations when all 12 jurors are present. I am now releasing you from that order. However, I do have another admonition. You have the absolute right to discuss or not to discuss your deliberations or verdicts with anyone. It is appropriate for the defendant, the defendant's attorney, the prosecutor, or any representative of them to ask to discuss your deliberations or verdict with you. However, such a discussion can only occur with your consent and only if the discussion takes place at a reasonable time and place. Any unreasonable contact with you by any of them must immediately be reported to this court. Any unreasonable contact with you is a violation of a lawful court order and shall be subject to reasonable monetary sanctions. Therefore, if you choose to discuss the case with anyone, I urge you to be circumspect in your remarks. Please feel free to discuss the case from your perspective, but also be respectful of your fellow jurors and their views and feelings, and permit them to make the decision whether to discuss the case with anyone. Whatever you do say, you should be prepared to repeat under oath at a later time, were that to become necessary. Your names, contact information will be sealed pending further court order. Should there be a request for the release of your personal identifying information, you will be notified in writing before the release of any such information by this court. And that will be by mail at your last known address as shown by the records of the court. You will also be given a chance to respond to the request for your personal identifying information. And with that, thank you very much, and you are excused.
You have been listening to Judge Alvin Harrell instructing the jury after they just momentarily ago announced that a not guilty verdict has been reached unanimously in the child cruelty case against Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula. As the jury was making that announcement, you saw Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula nodding emphatically, a little bit of emotion, perhaps not being picked up on that camera. This has been going on for the better part of a month. Jury selection, 6 men, 6 women, was started back on May the 2nd, I believe. You can see the attorneys now patting and rubbing each other on the back a little bit. No doubt a congratulatory feel there. No doubt we're going to bring in our legal analyst, David Mugridge. A lot of relief for Joaquin Arambula.
And you even saw one of the defense attorneys wipe her eyes with a tissue and then pass a box of tissue to family members, presumably sitting just in the gallery.
There's no doubt about it. In a situation like this, the emotions are high right up until the time that the jury comes back with their verdict, and then there's a flood after that. You know, you've gone through all of this stress in his life, and his family's been, you know, under a microscope. He was fortunate. He had 2 of the best attorneys in Fresno County. They developed a good relationship, and they presented that rapport, and they presented the real true persona of Dr. Arambula to the jury.
And you saw some heartfelt hugs there. David, you're a defense attorney. You see a lot of this stuff. Were you surprised by the verdict?
Not really. I said all along, originally, I thought the district attorney was going to have a hard time getting a unanimous verdict. And as the case went on, I then started thinking that the district attorney would have a problem even getting one person to join them. So I'm not really surprised by the verdict. The evidence came out fairly well from the defense. They had some excellent professional experts that showed up and testified. They had numerous family members. The girls came on and did very well. No, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And the jury deliberated for about 4 hours on this. Does that give us any insight as to what was maybe going on in the jury room?
Well, you know, you can talk to 5 pundits and get 5 different answers
Right.
to that. You never know. That's why there's so much emotion that's involved in these things, because you know, it could have gone either way. I'm sure both sides, as they walked in there, really weren't sure. They were hopeful. I've had times when a verdict comes back quickly and you think, aha, you know, it goes one way or the other, and it doesn't always work that way.
Once again, if you're just joining us, Joaquin Arambula found not guilty of child cruelty charges against his 7-year-old daughter. David, we were hearing the judge instruct, not so much admonish, but instruct the jury on how to conduct themselves now that this trial is officially over, and dismiss them, i.e. regarding interviews with people in the media and that sort of stuff.
Right.
How do you see that playing out with such a high-profile local case like this?
Well, you certainly want the opportunity, if you are an attorney, whether or not you're a defense attorney or a prosecutor, you want the opportunity to talk to the jury. Because you want, as a professional, you want to learn from what you've gone through, and hopefully learn to do a little better the next time. If the jury saw some kind of a problem with your approach or presentation, you want to learn from that.
And so you think the prosecutor is talking to the jury, or you think both sides are?
I've never had a case where I've had the opportunity as a defense attorney to talk to the jury when the prosecutor hasn't always gone in. That would be unusual.
Okay, so he's probably debriefing.
Undoubtedly. He's there right now talking to him.
What can we learn about this case? We were talking earlier about how this really, in some ways, defines what is appropriate discipline inside the home, a spanking on the buttocks versus the next step.
Well, these are fact-driven cases, and there is, as I've said all along, there is no hard and fast, clear-cut rule as to at what point discipline becomes abuse. Each case has got to be taken individually on their own merits, and you have to develop information, which is exactly what the defense team did in this case. They brought in all of these people that they had working on the case, including the CPS. They actually used the CPS to their advantage against the prosecution, and that is somewhat unusual, and they did a very good job in doing that. There's a lot of lessons to be learned here, the least of which, or not the least of which, is Civics 101. This is how trials should happen in the United States, with both sides putting on an aggressive presentation and arriving at what people can walk away and say, justice was done. And in this case, justice was done.
So the defense attorney yesterday said this reflects poorly on the criminal justice system. Perhaps he has changed his mind today?
I have a suspicion that now Michael Aide and Margarita are feeling a little bit differently about it, yes.
Yeah, vindicated. Once again, if you're just joining us, Joaquin Arambula found not guilty on 1 misdemeanor count of child cruelty. Of course, we're going to have live team coverage on this ongoing story coming up tonight at 5, 6, and 7, and again at 11.
And so if you would like to stay with our live coverage, we are going to continue online, and again we will have updates on air during our newscast, but you can just go to our website yourcentralvalley.com, and we will have continuing coverage on this for our digital viewers and for our on-air viewers tonight beginning at 5.
And in the meantime, we're going to send you back to regularly scheduled programming. Well, if you're joining us once again online, we now, as you've already heard, know the verdict. Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula in his child cruelty case found not guilty.
And let's toss it over to CBS47's, actually we're going to toss it over to David Mugridge, our legal analyst, and we've been talking about what comes next for the family. How do you think they move forward after this?
Well, certainly with a lot more conviction and a lot more resolution that their method of disciplining was the right thing to do.
Right.
It did bring out to the public that they had some problems, like all parents and all families do, but thank God they recognize that they're human, and so they're undergoing some counseling, which could only help the resolution of problems with their family. We can all hope and pray that their family, you know, has learned from this, as well as the community, about the seriousness of these kind of allegations, and thank God that it resolved the way it did.
Yeah.
CPS did their job, and more importantly, the pillar of our democracy. The jury came in and they reviewed the evidence and they made a determination.
All right, David. Yeah, go ahead.
Prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Steve Wright is speaking now about the case. Let's listen in live.
To other people or other elected officials?
Well, I think it shows to anybody. Again, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do for a living. If you abuse a child, we're going to do what we can to protect that child and to hold that person accountable and make sure it doesn't happen again.
What does this mean for the family moving forward?
And, you'd have to ask them about that.
What was your response to them saying this was politically motivated?
Absolutely not politically motivated. Again, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you do for a living. If you abuse a child, we're going to do what we can to hold you accountable. The politics had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with our filing decision in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You were just listening to Assistant District Attorney Stephen Wright, ADA Stephen Wright. How common is it, David Muggeridge, joining us once again, for the prosecutor in a case to speak with the media immediately afterwards?
It happens probably 50% of the time.
Yeah.
Not as often when they lose, and particularly when they lose a big case like this. I mean, this is only a misdemeanor, but the way it played out, it was probably the most significant misdemeanor case of the century for Fresno County.
Right.
Because they probably devoted a lot of resources to this as well.
Undoubtedly. But you know, you also hope that maybe this is a learning experience for the district attorney's office. Maybe they will evaluate in the future whether or not they want to do it again in a case like this, and maybe they'll decide we'll rely on CPS in the future.
Yeah.
Who knows?
One of the things we've talked about, David, in the newsroom is why did Joaquin Arambula go to such lengths, bringing his 7-year-old daughter, his 6-year-old daughter, his mom, his wife into the courtroom over this? There was a lot more on the line than just the potential of a 6-month misdemeanor sentence. There was his medical license, his place in the assembly. Talk to us about that.
Well, you have to remember, and I've had people say this and ask me that question, it wasn't Dr. Arambula that brought them in. It was the prosecutor that forced them to bring them in. When they decided to go forward, at that point, once the decision has been made to prosecute, the defendant and his attorneys must rally and must present their own evidence. Now, the evidence in this case came from family members and friends and from the cross-examination of Dr. Arambula's 2 little girls.
Right.
But they had no choice in that matter. They had to bring in the evidence of what the little girls were like, what their family life was like, the problems that they experienced with these little girls. That wasn't Dr. Arambula's decision. That was the district attorney's decision initially to prosecute, because the only witnesses they had essentially were the 2 little girls.
And Dr. Arambula and other family members had described the 7-year-old daughter, the alleged victim in this case, as imaginative, sometimes dramatic, sometimes difficult. And so I guess they kind of put her character on trial as well. They
did, but you got to remember, again, we're talking about a 7-year-old girl and relating to a 6-year-old sibling. What I saw in the courtroom, I saw a precocious girl, as she was described, but I also saw a little girl that was a typical 7-year-old. You know, she was at times flighty. She almost skipped out of the room after she was done with her testimony. And I can't help remember this vision that I had of her up on the witness stand with her little pink teddy bear and her grandpa standing next to her.
Wow.
It just brings tears to your mind when this happens. Unbelievable.
How does that play out with the jury when they're listening closely for every single word that a witness is saying, be it a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old? How do they weigh that evenly? How do they discount that, or how do they keep it even?
It's one of those pieces that we talk about as silent evidence. Now, nobody really is given an instruction that you can consider, you know, whether the daughter skipped out of the room. You can take into account the fact that she actually ran over to the person she called her daddy and gave him a big hug in front of the jury. I mean, their hearts were undoubtedly melting. And then you put that together with the 2 doctors that testified, particularly Dr. Weir, who testified, I've examined this young lady and I find no evidence of abusive conduct that she's had to undergo. Those kind of things woven together make a huge impact on a jury, and they did in this case.
Do you think they can then hold that against the prosecutor?
Well, on the other hand, no, because the prosecution has a job to do. We have an adversarial system of justice in the United States, and it works if we each do our job. Their job was to analyze whether or not they thought a crime had been committed, For whatever reason, they didn't agree with CPS, that they thought a crime was committed. And at that point, once they made that determination, they were kind of boxed in. They had to go forward because otherwise somebody would say, well, if it hadn't been for the fact that it was Dr. Arambula and an assemblyman, you would have gone forward and you would have prosecuted them. So when the lines were drawn early on in this case, essentially neither party could back off. You had to go to trial.
Do you think that, and we've talked about this, Catherine, in the newsroom, just amongst ourselves, if it was just a regular person, not an assemblyman, not a doctor, not a high-profile person, do you think this would have ever gone, as a misdemeanor, ever gone to trial?
Probably not. In my experience, very few of these cases ever make it to trial. People generally are not as worried about the consequences, so they're okay with pleading no contest, for example, to a misdemeanor child battery case. They don't worry about it.
Right.
But in this case, you had someone that potentially could lose his license to practice medicine, could lose his clientele.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a pediatrician. Imagine what would happen if he was convicted of child abuse. Would you want to take your children to somebody like that?
Yeah.
And then you've got his position as an assemblyman. He had no choice but to go forward.
And so now he is free and clear, no chance that charges could be filed against him again, and this is done.
It's over.
And we're waiting, David, to hear, we think we're going to hear from his defense attorneys, Joaquin Arambula's defense attorneys. Once again, if you're joining us late in this online broadcast, Dr. Joaquin Arambula, Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula, found not guilty of child cruelty charges against his daughter. And we're really waiting to hear from the defense team. You're a defense attorney. What would be your posture at this point?
I would probably be in tears. I would be so relieved and so happy for my client. And I know Michael is. I talked to him during the lunch break today, and he was as nervous and skittish as somebody going on a Broadway play on the first opening night. Didn't know how the public was going to react to it.
Yeah.
Wasn't really sure what the verdict was going to be. He was hopeful, and I kept telling him, you know, what a marvelous job that he did, but he was still very much antsy.
Yeah,
For the verdict.
and drill down a little bit on what a marvelous job he did, because in closing statements, I heard you talk earlier about how he did it pretty much off the cuff, without notes, walked around the courtroom. Is that unusual?
It's extremely unusual. In fact, it's rare. I have, in my short career, never seen anyone do, in a misdemeanor case particularly, never do the performance that Michael A. did. It was just absolutely amazing. He used no notes. It looked like he was just letting it all flow from the heart. I think the jury could pick up on that. He was walking around the courtroom freely, like he was in control.
Right.
Occasionally he would walk over behind his client, Dr. Arambula. I even saw him at one point put his hand on his shoulder. So he was making the personal connection with the jury that I think the prosecutor had a little bit more difficult time doing.
And along those lines, we talked about the body language with his daughter, who gave potentially damaging testimony against her dad, skipping out of the courtroom and then running up to hug him later. Talk to us about the optics of his own defense attorney walking around the courtroom and Joaquin Arambula sitting there, and he put his hands on the chair directly behind him. What does that say to the jury as they're looking at that personal touch feel?
It does something that you can't overtly do as an defense attorney. We can't go in there and say, if you ask me, my personal opinion is, you know, my client didn't do it. But when you walk up behind your client and you make that personal connection, and then you say, we believe, there's no question in anybody's mind what Michael Aid was thinking.
Yeah.
And then they did some very wise decisions throughout this. They had Margarita Martinez Bailey cross-examine the girls. What a marvelous, fantastic, strategic move to have, you know, the woman attorney dealing with the children, with the girls, putting them more at ease. And she did a fantastic job in her examination of the girls. Just amazing.
The optics on that is important because why?
Well, because you don't want to make it look like to the jury that you've got a man, a guy beating up on a little girl. I mean, here's the younger daughter sitting there on the witness stand, cute as a button.
Right.
You could hardly see her head peeking above the witness stand, and in front of her, she had her stuffed toy elephant that she calls Ellie. I mean, you know, you couldn't have planned it any better if you deliberately decided to do that. Fascinating, fascinating. It was a great experience I think for the community to see how trials can be held, how everybody does their job. I mean, Mr. Wright in this case had a job to do, and he did his job.
ADA Stephen Wright, the prosecutor
Yes.
in the case, yeah.
And did you ever get a sense from, did the jury seem to be paying attention to all the testimony that was going on? Did attentions ever waver when one side was presenting part of their case?
I saw very few moments. There were a couple, but I saw very few moments when the jurors really weren't following what was going on. There were some moments more than others where they were really captivated. For example, when the two defense experts got on the stand, Dr. Napolitano, and that was, again, another stroke of genius to bring her on. I've had the misfortune of cross-examining her when she's a prosecution witness, and I know she's excellent. And in this case, when you bring on somebody who's known as a prosecution witness, and now you bring him in as a defense witness, her credibility was enhanced tremendously.
For now, the jury, 6 men, 6 women, remain anonymous to us, in the media at least. Peel back the layer a little bit as to when you're doing the voir dire, picking the jury, and you decide who you've got. Talk to us about what a member of the jury must be thinking in a case like this if they think, have I ever spanked my child?
Well, that's one of the things that Michael Aide was talking about in his closing argument. And I think that's one of the things that the community can actually learn from a trial like this. I mean, this was really Justice 101 for everybody here in Fresno, to start thinking themselves, because there is no fine line. It's very fuzzy. At what point do I have to stop when I'm disciplining my son or my daughter, and has it gone over the line, and is it now abusive? And everybody's different on this. Some people that were excluded as jurors early on said, hey, if you use a belt, as far as I'm concerned, it's over. You've committed child abuse. Other people said, I don't believe in any kind of physical discipline of a child at all. And then some people said, you know, there is some times where it's appropriate to use physical discipline, and other times where it isn't. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
And also, too, this had all started with the little girl going to school and the school reporting. Do you think there will be discussions in schools, or do they have a clear mandate as reporters to, if there is any suspicion, to contact police?
Well, this proved, again, that the system worked because the teachers, God bless them, had a little student in their classroom that had made a complaint, and right or wrong, the little girl said, this is what happened to me, and that teacher, because they're a mandated reporter, had to act, and she did act. And then CPS had to get involved, and they did get involved. And then the prosecutor had to present a case if they believed it was there, and they did. So this is proof that the system actually does work, and it should cause people to start thinking about their own discipline, and it should be something that could be perhaps given as a instructional lesson to teachers in the future. This is why you must report it, and these are the circumstances under which you do report it. And remember how you notice what's happening, how you write your notes, how you convey the information to the authorities. It was a tremendous example of justice gone right.
We have, I think, David, a live picture of a podium being set up for a press conference that's about to happen shortly. We are anticipating, David, that we're going to hear from the defense attorneys, from Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula, who, if you're just joining us, has been found not guilty of child cruelty against his daughter. I'm going to double back, David, around with something you were talking about, the discipline of children. Do you think that the social norms and mores have changed in this country from when, back in the day, in high school, you could be sent to the principal's office and get swatted with a paddle, versus what is permissible, what is acceptable in today's 21st century?
Well, it does show that the standards have changed. I can remember when I was a grammar school student, if you misbehaved at the end of the day, you not only had to take care of the chalk erasers and clean the boards, but you might have to stand up in front of the classroom, hold your hand out, and the teacher would, you know, take a ruler, you know, a yardstick, and you hope that you weren't at the end, because that's where the whip of the yardstick came.
Right. If you're watching right now live, Joaquin Arambula and his wife Elizabeth are now in frame. We are anticipating David Mugridge, that we're going to hear from him and his lawyers momentarily. Let's listen in, see what we can hear.
Is everyone okay?
This is not working for
I can wait a minute. I'm not trying to rush
A little
through
bit of
it.
chaos. We're trying to get a clean camera shot. This is obviously impromptu. If you're just joining us, Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula, surrounded by his wife and lawyers, about to speak.
First, to my family, I want to say thank you to you all. You have been my rock and my foundation through these difficult times. I want to apologize to each of you that we had to go through this, but now we are here and on the other side. To my wife and my daughters, you know how much I love you, but I just want to say it publicly so that everyone can hear it. I would move heaven and earth for you, and I'm proud that my wife was by my side each and every day through this hard trial. To the members of the jury, I appreciate your service. I trusted in the system, and today you have restored my faith. Thank you for recognizing that I am a good father and that I did nothing to harm my daughter. However, I know that there are still problems in our criminal justice system and that everyone needs to be treated equally and fairly, and that we need to ensure that the scales of justice are balanced. You can be sure that I will be working on that in the state legislature. To my constituents in the 31st Assembly District, I will always fight for you. I will continue to proudly serve you in the state legislature and will carry your voices to Sacramento to make sure you are heard. To the media, I would ask that you please respect my family's privacy as we move forward from this nightmare. My children have been the subject of a spotlight, but they are children and deserve to grow up in peace and to play like normal kids. Please let today's verdict be the end of this chapter. Now I am off to be with my wife and children, to be a family without accusations of any wrongdoing. It is time for me to do what I do best as a father, to sit and to play with my girls on the ground, to tuck them into bed tonight, to read them a story, and to let them know that their family loves them and will always love them. Thank you all very much, because today justice has been served.
Dr. Rebel,
thank you. I plan on returning to work on Monday. Thank you all very much.
Assemblyman, how did your daughter
So again, that was Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula, found not guilty by a jury today on misdemeanor charges of child cruelty. Arambula thanked his family and apologized and said, now we are here on the other side of this. He also reiterated that he loves his wife and daughters and says he will go home tonight and do what he does best, playing with his daughters on the floor, tucking them into the bed, reading them a story, and letting them know that he loves them.
And we are back with our legal analyst, David Mugridge. He said of his family, they're his rock and his foundation. He thanked the jury for the ruling. He also kind of a little bit of a veiled threat, problems in the criminal justice system, and that he's going to address that when he gets back to the state capitol. He also thanked members of the 31st Assembly District who voted for him, and he asked the media for privacy for his family.
I think that one of the many benefits that's going to come out of this trial, as a criminal defense attorney, I've now got an ally. I've got somebody who understands what it's like to be accused of a crime that you have not committed.
Right.
And he's going to take that back with him to the legislature, and thank God, because that's a positive that can come out of this, that people start thinking about the rights of the accused, and not just in name, but in reality, truthfully. And that's one of the things that Michael Aide talked about in his closing argument, how difficult it is when people come into a courtroom and they hear John Doe has now been accused of this particular crime. And ladies and gentlemen, I know that you're having a hard time believing that he's not guilty, even though you're being told that. Dr. Arambula has now suffered through that, and he understands what that means. And if he can go back and do something about it in the legislature, God bless him.
Because once that accusation is made, you can't fully unring that bell.
That's correct.
As Michael Aide had said also, some people are going to have their opinions of him one way or another, even no matter how it turns out.
And that's why the best that could have happened for Dr. Arambula is the not guilty verdict, but there will always be somebody out there that's going to doubt it or going to take some advantage or try to take some advantage of that. But now he's not only got CPS that said he did nothing wrong, he's got a jury of 12 of his peers that looked at it and said, you've done nothing wrong.
Right. And he said at the end of that live press conference we just saw that he's returning to work on Monday. And if he pursues this immediately, which it sounds like he might, well, what would that look like? How do you legislate something like that?
Well, there may be some involvement in the issue of bail that we've been recently talking about. Maybe he'll start looking at that. There may be some interest that he might have in trying to get involved with the Judicial Council, involving the appointment of attorneys in indigent cases. There was a study that was done recently that showed that defense attorneys, by and large, throughout the United States, get paid substantially less than prosecuting attorneys, and that's not right, and maybe he'll get involved in looking at something like that, see if we can adjust that with California legislature, come up with some way to make sure that a district attorney and a defense attorney with the same experience and background are paid the same. That should happen.
Speaking of defense attorneys, let's listen in once again live now. One of the defense attorneys for Joaquin Arambula speaking live right now.
Regardless of what the testimony came out in this particular case, I stand by my statement to the jury that I thought if this would have been you or I in the same situation, that this case would not have been filed. And I think it's further exampled by the fact that emails were going back to top law enforcement officials immediately, that multiple sergeants were notified the day of the event, that the police department, or at least the initial investigating officers, knew this was a political hot potato, and they handled it the way that they did, which I thought was not appropriate. They chose to do what they did. I do think it has political overtones. I think that the fact that Child Protective Services got involved and did their investigation in the case the way that they did it, that if law enforcement would have taken the same approach, the result would have been the same, and that would have been no findings and no filing of this case.
Do you think that his interviews with GV Wire and the rest of the media a day or two after the arresting incident may have played a role in this? And do you think he told the truth to the media?
Look, I wasn't a part of the media consultations on this case. I didn't recommend that he speak to the media. He's a political figure. He was getting significant requests from media to make a statement. Obviously, as a constituent or having constituents in this area, he has an obligation to make statements. He tried to do the best that he could. That was not with the advice of counsel. My advice with anybody, regardless of whether or not they're the President of the United States or somebody who's homeless below a bridge, is you don't talk to law enforcement, you don't make statements, you have your day in court, and you let the process move forward. That's what our system guarantees, and that's what I recommend to anybody who comes into my office when asked whether or not they should speak about a case publicly or to law enforcement.
He had originally said when asked in that series of media interviews that it was not politically motivated, so why did that change?
Like I said, I wasn't a part of any statements that he made related to the press. I wasn't part of his press team in terms of what statements were made or why, or those motivations. I think, I can't comment. That's a comment that he can only speak to.
Excuse me. What you have to understand is at the time he made the statements, we had no idea. We'd not seen any police reports. The DA's office or the police department, no one has shared any information. So he doesn't know. It's not until we requested the emails from Lisa Smithkamp to Chief Dyer to sergeants that we get to see the bigger picture. And I do believe it was politically motivated. And it's too bad that we had to spend time, energy, effort, taxpayer money on this. It should have never happened. It should have never been filed.
Margarita, why were you emotional?
Oh, gosh, yeah. It was very emotional. I could hear Elizabeth Arambula sitting behind me or to my side, and she started crying. And if you've ever had to wait for a verdict, it's very stressful. It's the most nerve-wracking thing, especially when you believe your client is innocent. There's nothing like it. My heart was going to come out of my chest.
Yeah, this is an emotional case. I mean, think about this. Joaquin as a person was put on trial. He was put on trial. His family was forced to come into trial and testify against him. This entire case revolved around his family. So, I've been reading in the media, whether or not it's CD Wire, whether or not it's any other news organization, print media, whatever it may be, that Joaquin Arambula should take a deal and he shouldn't put his kids through this. He put his kids through this. He didn't choose to come before this court and have to defend against himself. He made no decision that this case would be filed against him. We provided discovery. We provided investigative reports. We reached out to the district attorney's office in attempts to resolve this case without the need for a filing, because we understood and we knew that this was going to become a media circus, for lack of better terms, and I understand the media needs to cover these cases. We're not saying that anything was wrong in that respect, but the comments that I've been seeing from both the public and the media is that he's putting his family or he's putting his kids through this, or he should have taken a deal. Well, you know what? The jury spoke, not guilty. That's what the verdict was. That's what we expected. We didn't get reports on this case until the first day that we appeared in court. In fact, we didn't get them until later that day. We reviewed those reports immediately. We saw problems with the case at its onset. We tried to provide information to the prosecuting agency so that they could make the right decision, and this is where we're at. We waived no time in this case. This case went to trial as quickly as it could because we were provided no real opportunities to resolve this case in a way that did not force his family through this.
Approximately how much is this case costing Mr. Arambula?
You know what? I don't know. Look, well, you know what? Where's his reputation? His reputation's in the toilet, right? Doesn't matter what the verdict was in this case. He has to live with this for the rest of his life, regardless of what the outcome was. It doesn't matter what the jury said. The jury said not guilty, and we think that that was the appropriate verdict. And in fact, we believe that he's factually innocent of these charges. But the reality of it is you're going to have a certain percentage of the population that now is going to look at him and treat him different. And if, for lack of better terms, he's going to be wearing a scarlet letter for the rest of his, both for his political career, his career as a physician potentially, and wherever he goes, people are going to look at him and they're going to make assumptions and they're going to make conclusions about who he is by the way that he was portrayed in the media, and he has to live with that. And that's not fair to him. It's not fair to his kids, because someday his kids are going to be old enough to recognize what was going on here. 7- and 6-year-old kids were brought into court to testify in a case like this, and they don't understand what's going on. You know, everybody thinks because this little girl sounds articulate and speaks well that she is emotionally the same age as an adult, and she's not. And she's going to realize that at some point in time. Her life's going to be affected forever. His life's going to be affected forever. And you know what? The only process he had in order to get any sort of vindication was through a criminal process. He had to go through this. So, you know, it is what it is. He's had to defend against that. It cost him a lot. Think about that. He has to go to sleep at night knowing that he potentially could have been committed or convicted of a crime here. He was charged with a criminal act, and he was charged with that criminal act before anybody ever looked at everything as a whole. And we tried to provide that information to the decision makers in this county who, whether or not they looked at it and decided it, or whether or not they knew better than everybody else who was involved in this process from top to bottom, who knows? They made the decision. The result is what it is. We're grateful that we have a jury system. We're grateful that a jury was able to listen to the evidence and make a determination. But the reality of it is that the public's going to walk around and they're going to make the opinions that they have based upon information that they really don't know. They're getting their information from what you write in your articles, what the news agencies produce in their clips, their 2-minute clips, their 3-minute clips, or whatever it may be. That's where the public's going to get their opinion, and they don't know truly what happened, and they don't have all the information that was provided. The jury had that. The jury made their decision.
Perhaps you should be asking the DA's office how much this costs to taxpayers, and you should be asking them what prompted them to pursue. And we have a case such as the Sladek case where you have a video and you can see what's going on, and they say they can't prove that case. And here we had no video, and it was always shaky from the beginning, but I'm assuming they believe they could prove it because they have an ethical responsibility to not go forward unless they think they can prove a case.
And not just that, imagine, look, Dr. Arambula was able to have lawyers to defend him. Imagine other people, other citizens walking around the county of Fresno that don't necessarily have the resources to be able to defend and give a proper defense in this case. What are they going to do? They're going to take a deal because they have no other choice. They have no other resources to defend themselves in the way that the Arambula family has. What if, I mean, for instance, what if that person didn't have family members who would be able to vouch for their character or their credibility, like Dr. Arambula has? They're going to be sitting on the other side of the coin, even though the factual scenario is exactly the same. So it's disappointed. It's starting to rain. So we really appreciate your time. We've wanted to comment to you the entire time we've been going, but you know, we wanted the process to take place.
What do you think about the fact that he did get kind of a fast trial?
Okay, once again, that was Michael Aide, one of Joaquin Arambula's defense attorneys, and Margarita Paez also talking about their thoughts on the verdict and on the case.
Yeah, and David Mugridge joins us, our legal analyst. David, I saw you nodding your head emphatically when Michael was talking about the reputation and the scarlet letter that is now around Dr. Joaquin Arambula.
Right, that's why I say win or lose, Dr. Arambula, as soon as he was accused of the commission of this crime, even if a not guilty verdict came out like it did, there are going to be people that are going to doubt it. There are going to be people that are going to question his character, question his form of discipline, and you know, they're still going to hold it against him. There may be somebody in election that'll bring it up even though he was found not guilty.
Okay.
All right, David Mugridge, thanks so much for
My
joining
pleasure.
us today on the verdict for Assemblyman Joaquin Arambula, not guilty on child cruelty charges.
Of course, we'll have much more on this breaking news story coming up on Eyewitness News tonight at 5, 6, and 7. In the meantime, stay tuned to yourcentralvalley.com. Join us on Twitter as well. We'll see you tonight at 5.